So Reagan, he started a big program, and along with the schools of the Americas here in the U.S., they were training paramilitaries to fight a lot of the native communities, and even overall the society in general in the Spanish-speaking countries, in order to attain the resources and political power of the area. So Reagan, um, along with a bunch of other stuff that he did, um, with the Fair Trade Act, with North American the North American Fair Trade Act, which is NAFTA. Installing corporations and maquiladoras all over Mexico and Central America for cheap labor and all of that, created a problem of poverty because they were leeching the labor, but all the profits were coming back to the U.S. and created these systems of poverty in the Spanish-speaking countries.
So NAFTA was a program. Is that the program that allowed people to come over temporarily on work visas to work the fields, and then they would go back home?
That was kind of part of it. So people were still coming in thousands, regardless of permission or not. Right? The U.S. has always had work visa programs. But therein is also the problem, right? Like why do native people need permission to do what they've always done for thousands of years, which is just migrate, right? So there's a difference between being an immigrant and being a migrant. Immigrant implies you're going to a nation that is not yours, but a migrant is someone who travels as they please, which is what we've done, as native people. So, and it's evident going back to all the trade routes from, Ohio, Cahokia, Chaco Canyon, all those areas, all the way down to Central America. So the process of migration has always been part of indigenous cultures, and we're just doing what we've always done, except now there's borders that keep us from doing all these things. Right? So when Reagan started doing all that and created the problems in Guatemala and El Salvador, Nicaragua, and all those areas, installing puppets, and which also then gave rise to the Zapatistas and various other groups, the EZLN, to fight back against imperialism and colonialism, modern colonialism. So there's always been some sort of resistance, and then what Reagan. So all these people, these kids that grew up in those times, are adults now. And a few years ago, 5-7 years ago, there was another big migration, kind of people leaving Nicaragua and all those areas. And all those are now adults that were there in the 80s. And they're like, leaving the poverty, leaving that the US created through all these programs. So it's a problems that the US created, that now the ones that were children then, that are adults now, are now reaping the poverty of what happened back then.
Right? Yeah, and a lot of that was the CIA going in and creating, having drugs being created there. They're funneling it into these communities down here in LA, and they're using that to fund the other wars that they're starting in other countries just to replace the government.
Yeah, and it's now with fentanyl being a big kind of newer quote unquote drug. Mexico is now the largest producer of fentanyl, so now that's being imported into the U.S. So it's the same recipe being kind of reintroduced, the same recipe, societal recipe, and a system of capitalism to create more systems of oppression. And so you see now, like Trump, for example. When Trump was in office, build the wall, all this stuff, right? Well, what did AMLO do? AMLO militarized the border between Guatemala and Mexico. So now Trump didn't have to build a border anymore. AMLO did it for him. So now
that's the previous president.
No, AMLO's the president now, the Mexican president.
I thought they just switched over to a new president, or she hasn't taken
office yet.
Okay.
Yeah. So Trump didn't have to physically build a wall anymore. So that whole idea got scrapped because Trump basically threatened AMLO and said, like, look, if you don't do this, we're going to pull out all this money. We're going to do it. So AMLO, with his whole supposed indigeneity for indigenous, did that, started the mega projects like the Tren Maya that displaces thousands and thousands of indigenous people, destroys hundreds and hundreds of archaeological sites, like complete disregard for Mother Earth and all the destruction that the bullet train is putting, that's going on around Mexico. So trying to create a Dubai-like tourism to bring in foreign money into Mexico with these mega projects, right? So the big airport that they plan to put, the big dam that they plan to put, so all these things, and with the disguise of we're working with indigenous people, but in reality, they create programs that are not for indigenous people. Sure, they create immediate jobs. Like immediately, 5 years, everybody's got a job. 10 years from now, once AMLO's dead and gone, the disparity that it's going to create, and the models are there.
So how does this create disparities specifically for indigenous communities? Because I know the way you're describing it, um, outside looking in without the indigenous perspective in mind, these sound like good things for Mexico, as far as creating and raising the GDP and building up the infrastructure. These sound like positive things for a country. So how do those things specifically displace the indigenous community?
um, exactly what you just said, the GDP. So it benefits the 1%, just like mega projects always do. In Dubai, like you take Dubai for example, they import labor, from India, from Pakistan, all those areas to build it. But the workers, they all live still in very bad conditions in Saudi Arabia. So in Mexico, it's the same thing. It'll benefit if you have a stop, like every 50 miles of a train, it benefits that local area of every 50 miles. But in between the eco destruction that it does and what it's done to the aquifers, to everything that they're doing, has long-term effects that in between all the small villages and towns are the ones that are not benefiting from all of it.
Okay, yeah, right.
So
So they're not receiving any of the wealth
no,
benefits,
they can't.
but their local forests where they go and get food, or their water sources are
Yes.
now being disrupted.
Yes.
So now they're having food scarcity without even the benefit of the wealth to buy it at this point.
As it is. And now on top of that, I'm glad you brought up the wealth to buy. There is a program that was created by Lázaro Cárdenas in the early part of the 19th century, which is a system created by the Mexica, which are the Aztecs, that divides land to the people based on usage, right? So for example, they still have them now. So now if you're a Mexican citizen, you have the right to land no matter what. But the government says, all right, you have this many acres, you can use this land for the rest of your life and forever. No taxes, nothing. But if you stop using it for 7 years, you have to give it up and give it to somebody else. So that's kind of, in the system, there's called ejido. So, and this system goes back prior 1492. So before, just how do you have a city like Mexico City at the time, Tenochtitlan, of 350,000 people, right? How do you give 350,000 people like access to land, right? Back then. So when Lázaro Cárdenas created this program, and now they're trying to get rid of it. So Salinas de Gortari, which was the president 4 terms ago in Mexico, started getting rid of the ejido program, and which now creates a privatization of the land. So because you brought up earlier of the Tren Maya, now the people don't even have access to ejidos. So now they could privatize all that land that originally belongs to the Mexican people, right? And at that point, it's not a matter in this structure. It's not a matter of indigeneity. It's not. It's the human right to have access to land.